la vérité touche au réel.
Young Zizekians have assembled. We have a very special guest. We have a special guest with us. Brian Becker, Dr. Todd McGowan himself, the inimitable Russell Sbriglia.
Isabel Millar.
Engaging the unconscious. In the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic.
Vanishing mediators.
What's going on, everybody? We are back. It is I, Method Manoni, and I'm joined today by the one, the only, the big Signorelli himself. How you feeling today?
I'm good. We are back with a banger. We've been in a sort of hiatus for quite a while after finishing Seminar 2, but we're back to complete the triad of early Lacan.
We've been in the hyperbolic pressurized time chamber. Don't think we haven't been training. We've just been remaining in Super Saiyan form so that we're more adept at shooting those kamehamehas off.
We're trying to get Super Saiyan signified right now, so
right.
That's exactly what we're trying to do.
It's the SSJ1.
Yeah, exactly.
SSJ2.
And the J stands for jouissance.
That's right. We're going for Super Saiyan Master Signifier 1 to the signifying and chain. Anywho, that's right. We are talking Seminar 3, Return of the Jedi here, third installment.
Yeah.
And I think after we're done with 3, we'll skip ahead to 7. That's
right.
the plan.
Well, the plan is just for everybody, just so you all know, we're planning on doing the major and more popular influential seminars, not only that are influential for Lacanian clinical work, but those who are interested in like philosophy, critical theory, Freudo-Marxism. They tend to draw from the more popular seminars like 7, 11, 16, 17, and 20, and even 23. So we'll be working in somewhat of that order. But for now, we will begin with Seminar 3, which is entitled Psychosis. Should I lead us off right here?
Sure thing. Yeah, we are going to begin at the beginning.
Yeah.
Chapter 1, Introduction to the Question of the Psychoses. Big Sig, what say you about the psychosis?
Yeah. And so the question concerning psychosis is interesting because we have to remember that Lacan is not just a psychoanalyst. He was a psychiatrist. So specifically, he studied the works of Karl Jasper and also worked under quite a few people in the French psychiatry community. Some dude named Clarence Bolt, who is very indebted to, and he will mention in this seminar. And then another person, Henri I, who he's very critical of, and he even has an essay dedicated to him in the Écrit. But the question concerning psychosis is interesting because he wants to know what it is about, because we get that there are these phenomenon of paranoia and delusion, but he wants to go back to Freud, like he always does in this instance, because he sees a dramatic shift from psychology, from psychoanalysis. And we already see the setback that psychoanalysis has during this time, because we have the rise of ego psychology and other sort of modalities that are revisionists from Freud's project. And now Freud was very aware of psychosis, but he never treated psychotic patients. Surprisingly, the only really case that he has to go off of is the memoirs of Judge Schreber, which will be discussed in the later chapters to come. But what's quite interesting is, as I said, is that for Lacan, these thinkers, Jaspers included, and just the sort of milieu are focused on these symptoms or these things called like delusion, these phenomena of delusion, paranoia, and other hallucinations, but they tend to, in Lacan's terms, get at it from an imaginary perspective, meaning or a sort of lack of meaning from an imaginary thing, in which we could probably talk about affects, etc., even so far as to correlate it with the sort of onto or psychogenesis thing, a sort of psychic cause, which he's very dubious of. We could even talk about how we could see it now in the DSM-5 as sort of clusters or chemical imbalance, sort of biological, physiological cause, which would trigger a paranoid delusion, schizophrenia, etc. And so what Lacan wants to get at is, and by going back to Freud, is to evoke what he's been talking about. Symbolic order, language, right? Now, what he does is he brings into question Hippolyte's commentary and Freud's essay, Der Verneinung, or as we know as negation. So why does he do that? Well, what Verneinung is, negation, is something that comes about from a neurotic subject. Now, neurosis is overall the big thing that we treat in psychoanalysis, and what Lacan, the subject in question in these seminars so far, have always been a neurotic or hysteric subject, obsessional or hysteric, but neurotic nonetheless. And so what drives neurosis is repression, and with repression comes the unconscious. So when we understand Verneinung, we're looking at a process of negativity that happens within the unconscious from the driving mechanism of repression. We shouldn't see repression as certain experiences or memories that are just pushed down within us, this cauldron of ids and psychic things that are hidden from the depths of us. That's a sort of depth psychology thing. We're not dealing with that. We're dealing with the unconscious that's structured like a language. So if you're tracking, language as signifiers are in this process of semiotic exchange in which we get a signifier that represents a subject for another signifier. What Verneinung does is it is a process within that gap in which something that was repressed comes up. And so if you remember the example of, I had a dream about a woman, but I guarantee you it was not my mother. This is an example of Verneinung in which we see something from the unconscious manifest an affirmative moment and also negate it. This moment is entitled in the German term Bejagung, or primordial affirmation, in which this marks a mythic moment in which the subject is first born. When we look at Seminar 1, he talks about this as well, and he uses the term Prägung, the imprinting or the striking, and it's like the mark of the coin, the face of the coin. This is the mark of the subject. It's the mark of the subject that happens as primordial symbolization. The symbol itself, language as a totality via the signifier comes about, but yet something goes wrong. And so that moment is repressed. And so through the mechanisms of repression, things like Bejagung, Verneinung appear. And so what does this have to do with psychosis? Well, it has everything to do with the fact that the psychotic is not in language. What we could see happen in primordial symbolization or Bejagung is also the moment of the admission into language. What that also means is alienation separation or symbolic castration. And so what Lacan wants to show is that the psychotic in these moments from a triggered paranoid delusion is at odds with this moment of admission of the symbolic order. He will also call it the threat of castration. It is this moment that we get a phenomenon of exclusion, or the exclusion of a phenomenon of castration. So what happens is that the psychotic is foreclosing this moment of admission into the symbolic order, in which they have to sacrifice something that they don't have. What they go off of before, and this is not even just the psychotic, but anybody in this mythic moment, when you're a baby, you don't have language. you have these cries and utterances, and it's the other, the mother, that has to signify this with a demand for food, warmth. Oh, you went to the bathroom, let me clean you, or just to be held, or just because it's a baby and it does not know what it wants. It does not have the motor skills set in its hardware like an animal does. So it is very much weak and dependent upon the other. And so what we have is this sort of imaginary hallucination that repeats of something that will happen when the baby cries, but then it slowly gets signified by language in this admission. But with the psychotic, this does not happen, because something happens that in this thread of castration, that they reject and refuse that admission, which is, as we will know, the master signifier, the know of the father, the name of the father, because with the admission of language comes a no. To evoke our friend Sam McCormick from Lectures on Lacan, he says, the prohibition means that you are no longer to live without prohibition.
Right.
And so this is what Lacan wants to tie in with Verneinung, repression on the level of neurosis, and how it differs from psychosis. We should not look at psychosis on the level of the imaginary, of getting at understanding through hallucinations, through this process of meaning and relation to the phenomenological consciousness, not on the ego, but on how the psychotic is not in relation to language at all, but refuses it. And so there is this weird relation between the imaginary order and this imaginary image that it is completely identified with, and that which cannot be accounted for in this imaginary order, so gets rejected and comes back into the real as an excess of delusion and paranoia.
There's no intervention of the castrating agency, which is the symbolic order. If you think about it, to be subject to language is to be subject to grammatical laws.
Right.
And there's no reason not to identify the law itself writ large with these grammatical laws almost. Yeah. I would go so far as to say, and when I say grammar, I don't necessarily mean like Latin grammar, but the kind of grammar which arises spontaneously, as we saw from the game of heads and tails, recreational mathematics earlier. It's a system that arises spontaneously and generates an internal logic of its own, but not on the basis of any kind of logic outside of it that would contain it. It's like almost a completely organic logic. What does that have to do with psychosis? Well, it's like with the psychotic patient, as you were just saying, I don't want to repeat what you were saying necessarily, but there is that rejection of castration. And with that comes a rejection of prohibition. Mm-hmm. Now, what we mean by prohibition isn't so much you can do this, you can't do this, but it's also the kind of prohibition that is the condition of possibility and impossibility within the symbolic order. So what is the symbolic order? Put simply, it is an artificial system of prohibitions that define what is possible and what is impossible, but not in the strict sense of what we think of as what is physically impossible necessarily, or what is ontologically impossible. It's a contingent, qualified sort of impossibility. And I think what this has to do with our subject at hand here, the psychosis, is it's like with this rejection of castration comes a different sort of relation to speech and a different relation to the ego. One could say there is no ego, almost, not in the sense of the neurotic ego, right?
Exactly.
Or
So
there's a complete identification with the ego.
Yes, that's correct.
And what I think, now I'm bouncing all over the place here, but what I think Lacan is getting at with this whole harping on psychogenesis as opposed to psychoanalysis, and why he's not a fan of these explanations that rely on certain very conventional notions of causality, is because he wants to approach psychosis dialectically.
Yeah.
Meaning we don't need, as psychoanalysts, to trace everything back to the cause of a specific delusion that supposedly lingers and obstructs the patient from gaining access to reality as it is in itself, but rather focus on the parts of speech which, and I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but the focus on the parts of the analysant speech which betray their relation to language and speech, that would contrast with the neurotics relation. So
And it's funny because let's go back to the L schema, in which we have a relation with the subject as S, yes, and the big other, but it's always sort of split in this relation. It's never direct. It's mediated by the ego and the little other. And so we know that the ego is an other, a little other. It's alienated in the imaginary sense, and the subject is barred by the big other. And so it manifests in the unconscious in this formation of symptoms of slips of the tongue, parapraxeses, the slips of the tongue, portmanteaus, dreams, and other manifestations of symptoms that may come about in both bodily and speech effect. But there is none of that in the psychotic, because what the subject is of the unconscious is also the discourse of the other, as Lacan has stated multiple times. And he says this in Function and Field of Speech of Language in psychoanalysis, that the unconscious is the other's discourse, and the other is what bars the subject. But there is a subject, there's someone who speaks in psychosis, but it is not the other. It's not a barred subject that's split from having and being in the way that the libidinal investment or the structure of the neurotic and hysteric are. They don't believe in a master, the psychotics. They are so aligned with their ego identification in the imaginary sense that it's what triggers a delusion when they encounter another person, because it disrupts the imaginary stability, because that's all they have. They don't have language like us. And so this is where I think D and G are right. The psychotic's not dealing with lack. They're not dealing with desire like lack. Now, I don't know if the psychotic has desire, right? I would still be very dubious of trying to get into desire as productive, but the way that they handle language or speech is different from a neurotic. They don't use metaphor. They literally think of things as they literally are, or they get lost in these weird scenarios. They have certainty in their delusions. So in a sense, the D&G sort of myth of body without organs, I'm a machine that couples onto everything. This is a perfect example of how they play with words, and rather than saying that these are metaphors, no, this is literally it. This is a perfect psychotic scenario right there, in my opinion. So I will give them that, at least. But yeah, there is this way in which language and speech interact and are performed with a neurotic versus a psychotic. And we look at Schreber's whole memoirs, we could see this phenomenon happen on various accounts. Especially when he talks about the sun rays and the solar anus and God and all these things as if they're actually happening. And I think he even says something about how he thinks of his work as something contributing to theology, rather, it ends up being a work that's most popular in psychoanalysis rather than even theology or science. But it's also funny that it's called Memoirs of my mental illness or my nervous illness, which is a strange title for some work that would be contributed to theology, in my opinion.
What does Lacan have to say about this concept of the elementary phenomena of, I think the guy's name is Clarambeau?
Yeah. And, that still is a little, ethereal for me, but I think ultimately what the elementary phenomenon has to do is what I was saying with the sort of primal imaginary, well, he wouldn't say imaginary, this Clarambeau dude, but it's a sort of like phenomenon that has to do with purely a sort of bodily imaginary thing that is not targeted around a sort of intellectual order of speech, language, critical thinking, sort of motor skill, perceptual thing. And in my speech earlier, I talked about the sort of Freudian necessary hallucination that happens in the relationship with the baby and the mother. So I think it's something that's registered along these lines. But for Clarambeau, I think he wants to tie this to a sort of like a psychophysiological thing rather than these sort of phenomenological, structural, and real registers of Lacan.
Right. And Lacan here, as usual, is emphasizing the three registers as essential, integral to understanding the workings of psychosis. And he gives an interesting example here of three different potential meanings of the color red. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
You could see it as an aberration of perception, which is going to be in line with his current understanding of the real. So an aberration of perception might just be, well, something that suddenly stands out, right? Like when you say sets itself in relief from reality as such in its continuity, as very jarring.
Yeah.
That's what I understand from aberration of
and I still like play around with this, but it's like when we like think of red, like we could think of the color red, but so many associations could pop up in a normal
but
everyday neurotic, like,
but that's not what he means for the aberration perception, though. That's the next one, right?
That would be the next.
Would be, he says, seeing red. That like a red-breasted robin sees the color red. Now, I might be mixing the metaphors,
right? And it's like a sort of hallucination.
That's imaginary, though.
Yeah. And that's all they have, because it's like what I was trying to get at is like, we don't necessarily see red. Like, when somebody's like, man, you don't want to fight me. When I get angry, I see red. It's like they don't literally see red. It's like a sort of, metaphorization of, to express the affect that comes about when they get heated. But a psychotic probably would not say something like that. I mean, maybe they literally do see red, but in the way that your typical dude that gets angry and gets in a bar fight, like, I just see red, bro. It's
right.
It's a play of words, and sort of like, even we have the whole thing. It's like, people are like, colors have certain emotional associations. Like some people feel tranquil when they see the color pink or something like that. I don't know, but I don't think that has to do anything with what the psychotic does in this aberration, because they don't have a sort of language association to the color and the signifier that represents the color.
Right. So we have the kind of red that, let's say, supposedly, I think this isn't true from what I understand. It's more the flapping of the red cloth rather than the color that makes the matador enrage the bull. But still, it's like this idea that there could be an imaginary association with a color that would provoke a certain reaction, and then the final definition to illustrate the symbolic would be within the differential system of a card game. The red card has a specific signifying meaning, but he's laying this out more so to illustrate, I think, how neurosis works.
Yeah,
with a psychotic, it's like
for instance, red, green, yellow. Those colors, what we associate with that, right? Red, stop; yellow, like yield and slow down.
Right.
No.
But when you say for the psychotic, maybe the color red might be speaking directly to them.
Yeah.
A conveyor of meaning.
Yeah, and
the psychotic experience is verbal and auditory or verbal hallucinations, visual hallucinations, directed specifically at them, as addressing them.
Right. And because the main thing about the psychotic is that they're totally identified with their imaginary ego, that we could think of it as like, all right, for the neurotic, especially for the obsessional, right? And this is where we could kind of flesh out the differentiation of ideal ego and ego ideal, in which the neurotic strives to have an ego ideal in their sort of symbolic placement of a symbolic identity. But if language is foreclosed, or the unconscious is foreclosed on the psychotic, they don't have that insistence of mapping themselves via language to an ego ideal, a representation that's mirrored and identified. All they have is an empty form, an ideal ego, without content to shape it. So
and that's what's really fascinating about it. The fact that there is this over-identification, this direct one-to-one identification with the ego. And it reminds me of our own explorations of the ego in Seminar 1, especially, and the idea of the ego as this ideational mass. And we were talking about neurosis at that point. And it's like the ego must necessarily be submerged for the neurotic to identify with it at the proper distance. And I think that's what defines neurosis in contrast with psychosis, is that the neurotic really only approaches the center of this ideational mass, which is just a sort of collection of identifications in analysis. And what happens is the entire ball of yarn begins to unspool at that point, the closer they get to the center of the ideational mass, which is an empty center. And the difference is that, well, I guess we have this ego ideal, which is much more clearly definable in symbolic terms. We have an ideal ego, which operates in accordance with this master-slave dialectic. The two are mirrors of each other, and it's almost like the difference between the two. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm just kind of theorizing haphazardly. It's like the difference between the two is the ego. It's almost like a differential between the two, like the actual ego. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like the ego itself must be kept at a distance, and there must be that primordial affirmation in order to enter the symbolic order and speak with the ego, as Lacan puts it, as opposed to being like smack dab against the ego and not having this kind of mirror. Does any of that make sense, or am I just...
Well, I would say that as far as for the obsessional, like as far as for them, the ego is always going to be the ego ideal that, is sort of keeping... It's not the ego that's keeping things at bay, but rather it's the ego ideal. And really, what is still alienated is the subject for them in the unconscious. And so for them, they're seeking an other. And that's where the dynamic of the master slave comes about, avoiding their lack. But that's the only difference I would make. But I definitely agree with what you're trying to say. Just that small detail.
I'm not sure I agree with myself because I'm just sort of spitballing here, but it seems to me that the ego is also semi-unconscious, is it not?
Yeah, I think, yeah, and this is actually where we get into these topographies that Freud talks about with, all right, so we have the conscious perceptual part, and then we got the pre-conscious, in which the manifest content usually comes about, and that's where it's like, okay, I have a dream about, like, I don't know, eating cake. That does not necessarily mean that, you know, that has like a sort of signifier that is a symptom to the latent content. It, especially if I had cake the night before, like that day before I went to bed, right, at like church or some shit like that, you know. And so this is where it's like, yeah, I think some of the ego can remain unconscious, and this is kind of like the unconscious that your object relations bros deal with, the sort of positions of the ego, which are defense mechanisms that remain unaware and are not realized by the analysan. But this is not what Freud wants to get at. Freud does not want to get at this pre-conscious field. He wants to get at the unconscious, the latent content that is repressed and is unaware to the analysan until the speech act comes about. And I think when we look at an obsessional, is that there is an imaginary identification, but it's always like extimate to them, in which they try to go outside themselves to identify with the other, what they symbolize, what they have, and imaginarize that. Almost in a sense, I wouldn't say fetishism as like the clinical perversion fetishism, but like almost fetishize the person's symbolic identity and become that one day, you know. And it's not like, for just like a normal everyday person, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, we want to, you know, be like the teacher that taught us Hamlet well, or Dante well, or Lacan well, because of like the way that they were always organized with the notes and all these types of things, right? These are sort of imaginary identifications, but they still have a sort of symbolic efficiency to them. But then it becomes a sort of obsessional thing when we end up rivaling against that person and creating this sort of like some symbolic pact and sort of life or death thing, in which like the obsessional keeps the other's enjoyment at bay, because to obtain that is to also kill themselves symbolically. And so it's always this impossible imaginary dynamic of mutual recognition.
Right. Because I guess that's what I was trying to express, is that the ego acts as a mirror, but a mirror that is located in the other, a mirror which is placed upon the small other that one meets.
Yeah.
And that creates a kind of master-slave dialectic where we are alternating between domination and submission.
Right. And so maybe we
That's
get
why
even
it has sexual connotations to it, and hence the sexuation of the subject in this way. But it's also like, but with the psychotic, this mirror of the other, which would secure recognition, is absent. There is no mirror.
No.
And he says here that the psychotic speaks with his ego as if it were a third party, but this is not the other in that sense, because
no, not at all.
Something that, again, almost apes one's performance of being an ego. It's like
being a speaking subject too.
Being a speaking subject.
Because what is the other as far as capital O? But
psychotic is spoken.
Right. Yeah, it's like where with the other capital O, big other, is the effect of speech, of language, actually, of language. It's the effect of the circuit of language, as Lacan mentions in Seminar 2, when he's trying to define what the symbolic order is and how the other comes about, the big other, especially from little other to big other, right? In his introduction, comes crucial, but this is absent in the psychotic, because as you just said, the psychotic speaks with their ego, but it's almost like a third party, especially in maybe paranoia, where it's like the ego that speaks is sort of referring to itself in third person, maybe like a sort of we would think of it like as, oh, that's like their like imaginary friend, but like no, that's literally like their friend or other personality. Not to get confused with multiple personality disorder, but like just for all like, nonchalant purposes like that, or when a sort of paranoid thinks like the government's watching them and intruding on their thoughts. This ego speaks in the scenario of a government that's hacking their thoughts, or aliens that came to them in a dream, and now like they have to like fulfill their like prophecy or something like that, and all these other sorts of scenarios that are common in a psychotic. All right, so let's get into what Lacan has to say about madness and his sort of gripe with how it's used in like the sort of zeitgeist of psychiatry and psychology. Because he even who does he reference? References some like Renaissance or medieval thinker talking about like how we're somewhat all mad,
Is it Pascal?
I think it is. Oh yeah, it is Pascal.
And then he also references In Praise of Folly.
Yeah, by Erasmus.
Which is Erasmus. Yeah.
That's actually, yeah. Is Erasmus, is he a medieval thinker, or is he Renaissance?
I guess like Renaissance.
Yeah.
I think 15th century.
Yeah. And pretty much like he does mention Pascal, and then Erasmus is saying that like men are so necessarily mad that not to be mad would be another form of madness. That's Pascal actually, but like what he's trying to get at is that like this sort of proverbial wisdom of being mad, or just like if you're just eccentric or out of the norm, then you're mad, right? And it's kind of funny because, I mean, who's another French thinker that talks about madness and tries to sort of make it of identity is Foucault, right? And to try to combat it from the psychiatric movement. But Lacan is operating on a sort of different modality. He's doing it with psychoanalysis, something that even Foucault would despise because he does not like Freud. But what Lacan is trying to get at is like that for him, it seems like the way that maybe not madness itself, but the way madness as a term operates is sort of dubious and doesn't really get at the heart of the problem. Does that make sense? Of the heart of the problem of what's going on with psychosis. And if there's a cause of psychosis, then what is it? Because so far, as we talked about, we haven't necessarily talked about a cause of psychosis, but the way it functions and its relationship, or the way it's not in relationship with language in the symbolic order, as it would be for a neurotic and a hysteric.
Right. The dimension of speech is passed over for this false understanding. And he's going to talk about understanding again in the next chapter. In this chapter, it seems like he talks about Jaspers and this relation of understanding, and how it is not best to approach a psychotic patient as like trying to speak the patient's language, as if to gain access to the source of the problem, because what that means is that you are approaching that subject as if they were an egoic other that can be spoken to, which would mean that they would have a neurotic distance to their own sense of self, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And they don't have that, and that the purpose of analysis is not to understand, but in a sense to not understand. Especially, it seems like, with the psychotic, or else you will orbit. It's almost like you risk turning their delusion into an imaginary archetype. Does that make sense? Like,
and that would be like what Jung would definitely do. And I think Jung was definitely inspired by
it becomes constant. It's like as if you help to prop up the delusion by constituting it as something that's like fully formed for the subject in analysis, the psychotic subject themselves, as something they can like see and access and view, and like as if it does mean something. And it means something, but in a very different sense of meaning.
No, exactly.
Not meaning, and we'll talk more about this in the next chapter, but not the kind of meaning that points to another definite meaning as the point of arrival, as a signified.
Right. And so, and what we have to understand about meaning is that for meaning in Lacan, we have the imaginary meaning, which he's trying to get away from, which is something that, insofar the Asper Bros talk about meaning in the delusion, they see it in the sort of two-body way, in which that, like, oh, you are giving me a meaning and let me dissect it. There's this kernel of truth that we get at, and to kind of help you bring it to a way of relating and understanding, because you don't understand it at the moment. You're caught up in your hallucinations, your paranoia, and so let's bring you back to a level of unity in which that creates understanding, where it's like, for Lacan, meaning in the imaginary is always this intersubjective thing that he wants to get away from. I mean, if we look at the Portland letter, it's the fact that we don't get at meaning from the way that the letter is always inverted, and trying to like the police, they literally try to find the letter by digging through the entirety of the apartment, when the letter is right there in front of their face where they would least expect it. It's that meaning happens on the level of the symbolic order, in which the signifiers move through. The letter moves through it in its destination, even if it's delayed. But this is where he wants to flesh out. It's like, okay, how do we understand it? Meaning for a neurotic, but then where does meaning go for the psychotic patient, who even themselves would say that there is meaning towards their delusions and their hallucinations in particular? Because let's look at someone like Wolfman, who's talked about in the first section. Wolfman literally has hallucinations, but he's not a psychotic. And there are people that don't understand why Freud would post his failed case studies. Us Lacanians or Freudian, Lacanians would know. Most Freudians are classical Freudians that kind of are like ego psych bros. But it's interesting how Freud likes to post his failed case studies rather than his successful ones. But there's something interesting is that he is a neurotic. He's in the Freudian interpretation, he's suffering from infantile neurosis. Well, Lacan says he's he's a neurotic. He says he's obsessional, regardless if it's infantile, and that this is where Verneinung comes back. That the threat of castration comes about through his entire life, and I think it's, if I'm not confusing it with the Rat Man, I think it's definitely the Wolf Man that would try to pee or if flash his penis in front of the governess, and she'd be like, boys who act up like that get their penises chopped off, and that would scare him. And then not to mention that his sister would make fun of his genitals when they would bathe together or play together, and he had some weird sexual encounters as a kid and weird relation with his own body. And he definitely had some weird hallucinations and stuff. And retroactively, and this is where Verneinung comes in this hallucination of his finger being cut off because as a kid, he was playing with the knife and he cut his finger and it was only hanging through a flap of skin. And so that comes up in the hallucination. And why this is Verneinung is because this somehow ties in with threat of castration in this primordial scene of Biao Hung to bring about the relation between the imaginary plane where his symptoms come about and the symbolic or intellectual plane, which symbols, affirmations, and negations manifest. Because one thing that Lacan points out, especially in Seminar 1, is that it would appear that nothing at all in his sort of symptoms or whatever happens on the genital plane, which we could take as the sort of phallus or symbolic plane in which there's an Oedipal rivalry, right? It's almost like as if he was resisting that, and yet in this moment of hallucination, somehow, just by chance, and it's possibly just because of the fact that he was in analysis and that maybe his sort of father function was Freud, because he kind of looked up to Freud. He was reading a lot of Freud, and he sought Freud out. And so it's just in that moment that hallucination, rather than it triggering psychosis par excellence, rather was just a phenomenon of excess in the imaginary that was able to be accounted for in the admission for the symbolic. And that's why it's Verneinung.
And to tie it back in to language and meaning, castration is the condition of possibility for meaning to take hold in one's own symbolic universe. Means one, however precarious it might be, has a place within that symbolic universe, and that the I, letter I, first person pronoun, is able to assume certain symbolic identifications, again, however precarious they are. With the psychotic, I feel like, isn't there almost something like what the child who is on the cusp of developing an egoic self-identity experiences, insofar as they immediately identify with their rival? There isn't a clear demarcation between, again, in this the example that Lacan gives of the child who believes that when they have beaten the other, they themselves have been beaten.
Right.
Says no, they literally are the other in this moment, and they aren't able to fully objectify
Right.
the other as something distinct.
And
From
this
that.
is
And the psychotic is sort of like that in a way, right?
and it's like this is always begging the question of whether the wolf child was psychotic himself, right? And I think Lacan begs to differ because of the signifier of wolf that always comes up in these sort of manifestations of mirroring, because there's something that is sort of like amalgamation of what his ego is in these moments of mirroring. He does have these sort of psychotic episodes and paranoid delusions that result into violent acts, but it's like he's not hurting the other because there is a separate other that is trying to attack him. It's actually like himself, but then like he recreates these sort of castrating moments or moments of trying to go back to the womb. So it's like there's something about it, but yet it's always still mediated by the signifier wolf, where it's like there's almost a super ego. The wolf is like super ego for him. So it's like he's like a neurotic, an infantile neurotic with a lot of imaginary symptoms that appear psychotic.
But this one signifier is like the most fragile anchor of something like a semblance of an ego.
Right.
Or I mean, an ego at which like one would have a distance enough to manage life.
Yeah. And it's because like he had like he couldn't speak, like his speech was deformed, he had poor motor skills, he had very bad health, he went through like operations and through different hospitals and psychiatric hospitals before he landed into that hospital where Madame Lafort was treating him. But it's like even if he couldn't have speech proper, these certain acts had symbolic efficiency to account for signifiers as they would in speech. Like was it putting these objects on her lap, pissing, playing with sand instead of playing with his own feces and pee, like all these different things were like substitutes. And so like substitution was happening, but like it's almost like he's in this impasse of neurosis and psychosis. But I think it's Wolf that like still maintains his sort of structural subjectivity as a neurotic, even like as a child. He's a very young child. It's not like he's an adult neurotic.
Another point Lacan makes that I find interesting is that there are children who, when dealt a blow, like, there's one child in particular, I guess, who he might have worked with, who whenever he got a smack, he used to ask, was that a pat or a slap?
Right.
And then would react accordingly, depending on how it was defined for him.
Yeah.
That's like, this is a matter of pure convention and performance.
Yeah.
Essentially. This child, though, most likely is neurotic.
Yeah.
Because the point he's making in this section, and I don't think this relates exactly to what you were just talking about, but I just saw it. The point he seems to be making in this section is that with this supposed relation of understanding, it's as if we understand sadness as symptomatic of someone not having what their heart desires.
Yeah, no,
Weird.
but it really
As if
does relate.
one-to-one correspondence between the object that is outlined by a specific affect, and then the disjuncture between the affect and object, in some sense, what one desires. But he says, no, like what is illustrated with this example of the child asking whether the blow they received was a pat or a slap is that words matter, to put it simply. Words can make all the difference. And the fact that one can, in these situations, make a choice, decide how to react based on the specific context within this sort of differential network, is proof, is evidence of neurosis, and let's say being, for lack of a better term, normal.
In the key word that you just said, or the key term, making a choice, an unconscious choice, the forced choice of being or having. And everything you said does tie in with my example of the Wolfman, even if it's not particularly.
Please explain how.
Or not the Wolfman, the Wolf Child. That was a Freudian slip. It's because the fact it's like in these encounters with the Wolf Child, yes, he has these what appears to be on the surface delusions, psychotic episodes, but it's interesting in that all these repetitive encounters of him hitting his own reflection, hitting the other, even trying to attempt to cut his penis off with plastic scissors. It's that it always ends with screaming wolf and retreating. It's that this is a formulaic scenario. And so there is a sort of unconscious, as elementary as it is, he just needs one signifier. But there's never just one signifier. A signifier is always a binary. Well, and not in like the Derridian, like, oh, there's a binary opposition. It's like, no, a signifier is always split from itself, right? And that's what makes it a binary, the S2, right? There's never just S1. S1 then becomes S2, and so on and so forth. Yeah,
there's some really great examples in the sort of dichotomy between fides and feint that he's going to introduce in 2 chapters, but I don't want to talk about it yet because it really illuminates everything that you're talking about right now. But let's not get ahead of ourselves there.
Right. But as you were saying and bringing up the kid that's like, okay, was that a pat or a slap? It's like he's making the choice of conforming to certain rules of do I feel happy or do I react with sadness because I'm hurt from being struck? And then we could also think about it in another sense. He brings us up in seminar 1 where like even in mirroring, there's a sense it's where like did he say like a kid hits somebody but like he feels hurt, or like he gets hit but replies in third person, something like that,
right?
But I like, just like a personal example, I remember like, so I'm the eldest of 2 siblings. I remember my brother when he was like 2 or 3 years old. My dad used to roughhouse with us both, but like when him and I would roughhouse with my brother, he was learning language, and instead of saying, "Hey, don't hurt me," he would say, "Hey, don't hurt him." And I just thought that was really interesting, like thinking about that. But like the way, like, it's like there's a person being hurt, but like there's not fully identified with himself, but like as an other person, and he recognizes that, but like he hasn't fully assumed that identity yet, but acknowledging of a certain, someone is being hurt, right? And I think that's still a part of the sort of structure of your neurotic.
And your siblings are Paul and Ernest.
Paul, Ernest, and myself.
Yeah,
exactly.
Exactly. No, it's really interesting, and especially how it plays into psychosis as this inability to objectify oneself via the other. And it's like you would think your sibling referring to himself as him seems strange, but it's actually a sign that he's not psychotic.
Right. Yeah.
That way, wouldn't you say? It's like
Yeah.
trying to grapple with the other as oneself. But what I find really interesting here is that, was that a pat or a slap? It's like that question has to do with prohibition. And again, conditions of possibility. What are possible responses to a pat versus a slap? And what constitutes either doesn't matter, in the sense that it's like we're more concerned with an appropriate reaction than we are what is signified by pat or slap in terms of a graspable signified behind either of those terms.
Right.
So and I work with children. I teach at the elementary level, and they're very much concerned with rules rather than meaning, I would say. They aren't deeply concerned with what things mean, what one signifier points to vis-a-vis another signifier,
Right.
but how one should behave, how one should react.
Yeah, because like, when you get the kid that's like, all right, the kid tells them the sky is blue, right? Water's wet, right? And they're like, why is the sky blue, mom? But why? Why is water wet? Why did Judas rap to the Romans while Jesus slept?
Out of luck, like two dogs stuck.
Yeah, but no, like they will do that though, like, and it's like it's not enough to identify it on the imaginary level of understanding, but question the symbolic sort of structure, but still recognize that a symbolic structure exists. And
I mean, sorry to interrupt. I want to take back what I said. Like, they're not concerned with meaning, but they're concerned with meaning in terms of like laws and rules, whereas adults tend to, it seems to me, like portray meaning in terms of a kind of empirical causality that we all acknowledge as outside of ourselves, and a sort of like openness to any potential meaning is something we perform, at least. Whereas in reality, we're probably more like little children in the sense that we're also very much concerned with rules and conventions, rather than like the Socrates being like, but why? What's the true ultimate meaning of everything? How are we to react? And but the psychotic, on the other hand, it's interesting though, because they lack that prohibitory function. It's as if any element of language can be isolated, disjointed, and be a pivot point. Like everything could hinge on a syllable or something, because language doesn't mean in terms of rules. And
this is where D&G I think they're right about, like, disjuncture versus conjunction. It's like there's always a point in which like signifiers become disjunction, become disjunct, and there's like what do they call it? It's like synthetic disjunction and all this other stuff. But like they're getting at something that a psychotic actually does, but there's nothing revolutionary about it, because one thing that the psychotic is not a part of, and this is where we get into something like what Miller gets into, and people like Dwayne Rousseau and Mark Gerard Murphy talk about, in which general foreclosure happens, is that there is what's being foreclosed generally is the social bond. And what the social bond represents is the symbolic order and our identification with it. And so, like, for instance, even though we have the commodity, right, Coca-Cola, it says enjoy, and Zizek's like example of like, what does that mean? But like you see the advertisement commercials of like the Coca-Cola bottle being passed around by the DJ and everybody at the party. It's like that's supposed to represent a sort of representation of the totality of a symbolic order, or like just a social bond. It quotes the social bond, and the fact that capitalism and the way it is in late stage is that it also dissolves the social bond, so we have more general foreclosure. So to bring it back down to earth to Lacan, it's that the psychotic could disjoint things and create its own sort of symptom without having a sort of social bond or relation to the socius in a sense. But that's where we diverge from D&G because like they think that we could create a molecular social bond and group subjects, but it's like, no, that's not the case. You know, we just get sort of, you know, people that are in the periphery that, you know, never create a social bond.
Yeah. I like how you brought it back to social bond. And what's interesting again about the pat or slap is that the social bond is reinforced by acting appropriately in that situation. And like what would count as appropriate would also be the same sort of performance that would secure recognition for the individual. And gaining recognition within the symbolic order is of the utmost importance for the neurotic who's trying to gets in where they fits in, so to speak. But what's interesting is that it begins with not having an immediate spontaneous reaction to the stimuli in the world around you so much as like the ability to perform. I see this with my niece who pretends to fall down all the time. You know, she goes, "Oh my God, I'm falling." And then my sister will be like, "Oh no, did you fall?" And it's this game they play.
Yeah.
But that is the beginning of meaning making, not reacting in the way an animal would to a lure.
Right.
You know?
Right. Or in the difference where it's like, like a parent that's just like so disinvested, it's like, oh, you didn't fall, like, or just like not paying attention. It's like, yes, your sister realizes that it's a pretend, but it's like right there, the baby is cognitively mapping their symbolic structure and rules and regulations. Because what we're talking about is that yes, children don't have this purely imaginary sense, and this is where the mirror stage comes about. But the mirror stage could not happen if the symbolic order was already instantiated or the threat of castration was imminent for the admission of the symbolic order, right? An ego couldn't exist without that. There is a relation to both, as Zizek talks about in For They Know Not What They Do, with the one. It's that the imaginary is sort of hooked on a virtual point within itself that in its reflection creates the redoubling for symbolic order. We shouldn't see this signified as just this pure symbol on a topography, but a representation of an image. And this is why Lacan is so obsessed in his early stage with the imaginary and how it actually replicates symbolically, and why he says, please study optics, because it's something that can't be like reduced down to like a sort of atomistic point. You know, an image is always reflecting and redoubling on itself.
And I believe we should quilt it there.
Yeah.
All right. Chapter 1 is a wrap.